did some promos for Pawn Stars in the UK. And so what we did is we set old couples, elderly couples like in their 70s, we put them on a park bench somewhere, like feeding them pigeons.
In the world of Pawn Stars, surprises are part of the job. But some discoveries are so rare that they change the entire atmosphere of the room. When a guitar valued at an astonishing amount was brought before Rick Harrison, nobody expected what would happen next. The instrument carried a history few items could match, and a value that seemed almost unbelievable. As its story unfolded, even Rick struggled to hide his reaction. And the reason becomes clear the moment you learn what made this guitar so special. The deal Rick still cannot forget. If you have followed this show for any length of time, you already know that Rick Harrison is not a man who loses his words easily. He has talked his way through gold bars, presidential letters, and cars worth more than most houses, and he almost never blinks. So when something walks into that shop and actually stops him cold, you should pay close attention, because it does not happen often. What makes this story hit even harder is where Rick is standing in his life right now. As of this year, the famous shop on Las Vegas Boulevard is no longer under its old contract with the History Channel, and the classic version of the show many of us grew up watching sits in an uncertain pause. Corey has walked away to live a quieter life in Mexico, telling people plainly that he could no longer keep playing a younger version of himself for the cameras. Rick himself has started teasing a reinvented chapter he keeps calling the next era of the brand. And underneath all of that business talk sits a far heavier weight. Rick lost his father, the man the whole world knew simply as the Old Man, back in the summer of 2018. Then, in the cold opening days of 2024, he lost his own son, Adam, far too young. A man who has buried that much does not look at a piece of someone else's history the same way anymore. So picture all of that pressing down on his shoulders when a collector named Landon walked through the door carrying a guitar case that looked ordinary from the outside. Nothing about the moment screamed importance to a casual eye. Yet the second that case opened, the entire room seemed to lower its voice, and even the cameras felt like they were holding their breath alongside everyone watching. What was hiding inside that worn case was not just any instrument, and it was not just any year of make either, because the date stamped inside it pointed straight at one of the darkest chapters in American history, the Holy Grail hiding in a plain case. When Landon lifted the guitar out, he said the words that changed the temperature of the entire shop. He explained that it was a Gibson Super Jumbo 200, built in the year 1941, and that it had once belonged to the rock legend Stephen Stills. To most people standing there, that might have sounded like a nice piece of trivia. To anyone who truly knows guitars, it sounded like someone had just walked in with a piece of treasure most collectors only ever dream about touching. Let me help you understand exactly why hardened collectors lose their minds over an instrument like this one. Gibson introduced the Super Jumbo 200 in the year 1938 as the most expensive flat-top guitar the company had ever dared to build. The name itself came from its eye-watering price tag of $200, which sounds almost laughable today, until you realize that in those years, that single sum could have covered months of rent for an entire family. These early guitars were crafted with a richness that later models never matched, built with rosewood backs and sides that gave them a warm and singing voice you can almost feel in your chest. Every piece was finished by hand, decorated with that famous mustache-shaped bridge and crowned inlays running up the neck like jewelry. They were never meant for ordinary players, and almost nobody could afford one anyway. Here is the detail that turns rarity into something close to mythology. Gibson built only around 96 of these pre-war Super Jumbos across the years before the world fell apart, which means surviving examples are nearly impossible to find in any condition at all. Dealers who have spent their whole lives in this trade openly admit they may go decades without ever seeing one in person. The guitar Landon set down on that counter carried cracks and old repairs, and it certainly was not flawless. Strangely, that worn and lived-in look only made it feel more honest, because nobody fakes the scars of 80 years of music. This was the real thing, aged and proven, and Rick knew it the instant he saw it. What almost nobody in that room paused to consider, though, was the terrifying moment in time when this particular guitar was born, and why 1941 of all years turned a simple instrument into a frozen piece of a nation about to change forever. The year America stopped making beautiful things. Here is the angle that almost everyone who tells this story completely misses, and it is the part that gives me chills every single time. A guitar built in 1941 is not just old. It is a survivor of the exact moment when America stopped building beautiful things and started building weapons to stay alive. In the final weeks of that year, on a quiet Sunday morning in early December, the attack on Pearl Harbor pulled the United States straight into the Second World War. Almost overnight, the entire country was ordered to change what it produced. The government placed strict controls on steel, brass, copper, and the very materials that companies like Gibson needed to make their finest instruments. Beauty became a luxury the nation could no longer justify. So the factory in Kalamazoo did something that still amazes me when I think about it. The same skilled hands that had been shaping that warm singing rosewood were suddenly turned toward the war effort, building radar parts, glider components, and precision pieces for the machine guns that soldiers carried overseas. The craft of making music quietly stepped aside, so the craft of survival could take over. Then comes a piece of history that deserves far more attention than it ever gets. With nearly all the young men shipped off to fight, more than 200 women stepped onto that factory floor and kept the soul of the company alive. They became known later as the Kalamazoo Gals, and for years their work was hidden because the company quietly feared that buyers would not respect guitars they knew were built by women. Those women crafted thousands of instruments through the hardest years of the war, often scrounging the basement for spare wood when supplies ran dry. That is the true weight sitting inside this guitar. It was one of the very last of its kind to leave that factory before the lathes were turned toward war. Every other identical guitar Gibson might have made simply never existed, because the world had bigger and more frightening priorities. This single piece of rosewood and wire slipped through a closing door in history, and then it survived. A rare object alone can move a serious collector, yet rarity by itself was never going to be enough to make Rick Harrison hold his breath the way he did. Something else was attached to this guitar, a human fingerprint pressed into its story, and that connection is what lifted it from priceless towards something that felt almost untouchable. The living legend whose hands held it. The reason that guitar carried so much more than craftsmanship comes down to one name, and that name belongs to Stephen Stills. If you came of age listening to the music of the late 1960s, you already feel something stir when you hear it, because his fingerprints are pressed into the soundtrack of an entire generation. Stephen Stills helped build two of the most important bands of his era, first with Buffalo Springfield, and then with the group that became Crosby, Stills, and Nash, later joined by Neil Young. He wrote the song that turned into the anthem of an uneasy and rebellious decade, the one that warned listeners that something was happening and they had better stop and look around. That voice did not just entertain people, it captured exactly how a frightened and hopeful young country was feeling. Then there is the achievement that still stops experts in their tracks. In the spring of 1997, Stephen Stills walked into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and was inducted twice on the very same night, once for each of the legendary bands he helped create. No human being had ever done that before him. That is not the resume of someone who simply made popular records. That is the mark of a man who reshaped the direction of music itself. What turned this guitar from a beautiful artifact into a verified piece of history, though, was the paper that came with it. Landon did not just claim a famous name and hope people believed him. He carried a signed bill of sale, written out on an envelope from Criteria Recording Studios, the very kind of studio where music of that era was brought to life. The guitar later carried a letter of authenticity from one of the most respected vintage guitar experts in the entire world. That trail of documents is the quiet hero of this whole story, and I want you to sit with that for a second. Without it, this is just an old guitar with a nice tail attached. With it, this becomes a tangible bridge to a living legend, an object you could trace from a recording studio straight into a museum without a single gap in the chain. Now, Rick Harrison was holding a rarity in one hand and proof in the other, which left only one terrifying question hanging in the air of that shop. He still had no idea what a thing like this was truly worth, and the man he trusted to tell him was about to pick it up. The appraisal that changed the room. When it comes to stringed instruments, Rick almost never trusts his own gut alone. And for this guitar, he called in the one man whose opinion carried real weight. That man was Jesse Amoroso, the owner of a beloved vintage guitar shop in the city, and someone who has handled more legendary instruments than most of us will ever see in a lifetime. The way he treated this guitar told the whole story before he even spoke. He lifted it the way a person lifts something they are afraid might break, almost like it was made of glass. He ran his fingers across the aged wood and listened as 80 years of resonance hummed back through his hands. When he finally found his voice, he did not reach for clever words or careful hedging. He looked at it and quietly called it the Holy Grail, the one guitar every serious collector spends a lifetime chasing and almost never finds. His honest read on the value landed somewhere between $75,000 and $90,000 for the guitar by itself, before a single thought about who once owned it. Then, he explained the magic that happens when a famous name enters the picture. The connection to Stephen Stills, he believed, could add another $20,000 to $30,000 on top, pushing the whole package toward a six-figure dream. This is the part where the show usually becomes a battle, because Rick built his entire reputation on grinding a price down without mercy. Yet something felt different in his eyes this time. Landon walked in asking for $110,000, a number that sat fairly inside the expert range, and he made it clear he was not desperate or confused about what he was carrying. Rick opened low, the way he always does, offering $80,000 to test the water. Landon held firm and countered at $90,000, and for a tense stretch, it genuinely looked like the whole deal might fall apart right there on the counter. Then Landon softened just enough and offered to meet at $85,000, and Rick agreed almost before the words finished leaving the man's mouth. The collector admitted afterwards that the final number actually beat the lowest price he had been willing to accept. So everyone walked away believing they had won something that day. Yet the most fascinating twist in this entire story has nothing to do with the deal that happened inside that shop, and everything to do with what the open market quietly said about this very same guitar. What the open market whispered behind the scenes. Just a few months before this famous deal, this very same Stephen Stills guitar had already been offered to the public at a major auction. The estimate placed on it before the bidding was staggering, somewhere between $500,000 and $600,000, the kind of number that makes headlines and turns heads. Then reality walked in and humbled everyone. When the hammer finally fell at that auction, the guitar did not sell for anywhere near its dream estimate. It changed hands for only $50,000, a figure so far below the projection that it reads almost like a misprint. Later still, another respected auction house valued it at a modest $18,000 to $20,000, a fraction of the on-screen excitement. So sit with what that really means. The open and honest market, the place where real buyers spend real money valued this guitar at far less than the $85,000 Rick paid for it. That single fact tells you everything about the kind of man he was being in that moment. He was not buying a spreadsheet. He was buying a story, and he knew exactly what he was doing. This is not the first time Rick has done something like this either. Over the years, he has handed over enormous sums for objects that spoke to him on a level deeper than profit. He once paid roughly $111,000 for a mountain of silver and $90,000 for a guitar tied to the wife of the legendary Les Paul. He gave $95,000 for a beautiful old Lincoln, only to watch the seller turn around and pour the entire amount into gold right there at the counter. He has chased presidential history too, paying $60,000 for a cigar box that once sat on a president's desk in the Oval Office, knowing that another box like it had sold years earlier for more than $500,000. Yet, for every triumph, Rick has also been burned, losing real money on fake stones, false signatures, and provenance that crumbled under closer inspection. That long history of wins and painful losses is exactly what makes the guitar moment so revealing. Rick knew the risk, knew the market, and chose feeling over math anyway. To understand why a careful businessman would do that, you have to understand the quiet grief he was carrying the whole time. When the businessman remembered he was human, the old man built his whole philosophy on one cold and simple rule, and he repeated it to his son and grandson for years. He believed the most important lesson in the trade was learning to take sentiment completely out of business, to never let your heart make a decision your wallet would regret. For most of his life, Rick tried hard to honor that rule. Yet grief has a way of rewriting the rules a person lives by. By the time this guitar landed on his counter, Rick had already lost the father who taught him that creed, and he was walking through the long shadow of losing his own son. When you have stood beside that kind of loss, an old object that survived against every odd stops being merchandise. It starts feeling like proof that something fragile and beautiful can outlast the worst the world throws at it. That, I believe, is what truly happened in those few silent seconds when Rick held the guitar and forgot to be a dealer. He was looking at a survivor. He was holding an instrument born in a year of fear, built as a nation turned toward war, kept alive by hidden hands, then carried through decades by a living legend, and finally protected by a fragile trail of paper that refused to let its story be forgotten. Think about how rare that really is in your own life. Most of what we own vanishes without a trace, forgotten the moment we set it down. Yet here was an object that someone, somewhere, cared enough to document and preserve, simply because it mattered. Maybe you have an object like that too, something worth far less than its meaning, something you would never sell no matter the offer. That is the quiet truth hiding underneath this entire deal. Provenance, that trail of signatures and witnesses and careful records, is the only thing that turns plain wood and wire into living history. Without it, the guitar is just an old shape gathering dust. With it, the guitar becomes a thread connecting a frightened year, a fallen factory, and a grieving man who needed to believe that some things are worth keeping. So when people ask why Rick paid more than the market said that guitar was worth, the honest answer has nothing to do with money. For one rare and human moment, he stopped counting and simply chose to hold on to a piece of a story that refused to die. Please tell me in the comments whether you would have paid that price or walked away. And if you have ever owned something worth more in memory than in money, share that story below.